September 5th, 1798. The sun beats down on the limestone walls of Valletta, the fortified capital of Malta. Inside the city, French soldiers, veterans of Napoleon's Egyptian campaign, man the ramparts with confidence. They have reason to be confident. These are some of the finest fortifications in the Mediterranean, built by the Knights of St. John over 2 centuries. The French have artillery, supplies, and the conviction that no force in the region can dislodge them. Outside the walls, a very different scene is unfolding. Maltese irregulars, farmers and fishermen who've taken up whatever weapons they could find are maintaining a desperate siege. They've been at it for weeks, but they're running out of ammunition, running out of hope. The French know this. They're waiting for the rabble outside to give up and go home. Then something unexpected happens. Ships appear on the horizon, British ships, and marching off those ships, forming up in the Mediterranean heat, are companies of British redcoats. Not many, a few hundred at most, certainly not enough to storm Valletta's walls. But they're not alone. What happens over the next 2 years on this small island in the middle of the Mediterranean will be one of the strangest military campaigns in British history. A campaign that combined regular army discipline with irregular guerrilla warfare. A campaign where British officers commanded Maltese peasants, where siege warfare blended with naval blockade, where diplomacy mattered as much as firepower. And when it was over, Britain would control the most strategically important island in the Mediterranean, an island that would become the key to British naval dominance for the next 150 years, an island that would save Britain in World War II. Yet this campaign is barely remembered. It doesn't appear in popular histories of the Napoleonic Wars. It's overshadowed by Nelson's victory at the Nile, by the Peninsular War, by Waterloo. Most people who know Malta as a British possession have no idea how Britain acquired it or why it mattered. This is the story of the liberation of Malta, a forgotten triumph that changed the course of Mediterranean history and established a pattern of British imperial expansion that would be repeated around the globe. But to understand why this small island mattered so much, we need to go back 3 months before those British ships appeared. We need to understand how Malta fell in the first place, because that story is just as important as the story of its liberation. June 1798. Napoleon Bonaparte is at the height of his power and ambition. He's conquered Italy. He's forced Austria to make peace. He's become the most feared military commander in Europe. But he has a problem. He can't invade Britain directly because the Royal Navy controls the Channel. So Napoleon conceives a different plan. Strike at Britain's imperial interests, cut the route to India, threaten British trade in the Mediterranean and beyond. The target? Egypt. To get to Egypt, the French fleet needs to cross the Mediterranean. And right in the middle of that crossing, sitting astride the sea lanes, is Malta. Malta isn't just any island. For 268 years, it's been ruled by the Knights Hospitaller of St. John, one of the last surviving military orders from the Crusades. The Knights have turned the island into a fortress. The Grand Harbor at Valletta is one of the finest natural harbors in the Mediterranean, protected by star forts, bastions, and walls that have resisted Ottoman sieges. The Knights are theoretically neutral, but everyone knows where their sympathies lie. They're a Catholic order. They've been fighting Muslims for centuries. They're not going to let a revolutionary French army use their island as a base. Napoleon doesn't care about their neutrality. He needs Malta as a base, as a symbol, as a statement that nothing can resist French power. On June 9, 1798, the French fleet arrived off Malta. Over 400 ships carrying 30,000 soldiers bound for Egypt. Napoleon sends a message to the Grand Master of the Knights. He requests permission to water his fleet in Malta's harbors, all 400 ships at once. The Grand Master, Ferdinand von Humpesch, knows this is a pretense. If he lets the French fleet in, they'll take the island. If he refuses, they'll attack anyway. He's in an impossible position. He refuses. Napoleon attacks. But here's where the story gets strange. These fortifications that resisted the Ottomans, these walls that were supposedly impregnable, fall in 2 days. Not 2 months, not 2 weeks, 2 days. The knights barely fight. Some historians argue the order was simply too old, too corrupted by centuries of wealth and comfort to resist effectively. Others point to darker explanations: betrayal, secret negotiations, French sympathizers within the order itself. The truth is probably simpler and sadder. The Knights of St. John, an order that had defined itself by fighting for Christendom, couldn't reconcile revolutionary France's atheism with the practical need for Catholic France's protection against Protestant Britain. They were paralyzed by ideological confusion. On June 11, 1798, Grand Master von Hompesch surrenders. Napoleon enters Valletta in triumph. He stays exactly 6 days. In those 6 days, he systematically loots the island. The knight's treasury, the church's silver, art treasures accumulated over centuries, all loaded onto French ships bound for Egypt. Napoleon also issues a series of decrees. He abolishes the Knights' Order. He proclaims Malta a French possession. He establishes a French garrison of 4,000 men under General Claude-Henri Belgrand de Vaubois. He creates a new legal code based on revolutionary French law that overturns 268 years of knights' rule. Then Napoleon leaves. The fleet sails for Egypt. Malta is French, or so it seems. The Maltese didn't ask to be liberated by France. They certainly didn't want revolutionary French reforms imposed on them. The knights' rule had been paternalistic and often corrupt, but it was familiar, it was Catholic, it respected Maltese traditions. The French revolutionary government respected nothing. Within weeks, French authorities began stripping churches of their treasures to pay for the occupation. They closed monasteries. They imposed conscription. They treated the Maltese as conquered subjects, not liberated citizens. The Maltese began to resist. Small acts at first, refusing to cooperate, hiding food, then larger acts, attacks on isolated French soldiers, sabotage. By September, resistance had crystallized into open rebellion. On September 2nd, 1798, a French soldier got into an argument with a Maltese auctioneer at a slave market in the town of Medina. The argument escalated. A crowd gathered. Someone threw a stone. The French soldier fired his musket in the crowd. That single shot started a revolution. Within hours, the Maltese had risen across the island. They attacked French outposts. They killed isolated French soldiers. They seized weapons. The French garrison retreated into the fortifications of Valletta and the 3 cities around the Grand Harbor. The Maltese laid siege to their own capital. But here's the problem. The Maltese weren't soldiers. They were farmers, fishermen, craftsmen. They had courage and fury, but they didn't have artillery. They didn't have military organization. They didn't have supplies for a sustained siege. The French, trapped in Valletta, had all of those things. They had fortifications built to resist Ottoman armies. They had cannons. They had trained soldiers. All they had to do was wait for the Maltese to run out of ammunition and give up. That's the situation when the British ships arrived on September 5th. The Maltese rebellion was 3 days old and already running out of steam. Without outside help, it would collapse within weeks. The British intervention in Malta wasn't planned. It was improvised, opportunistic, and it changed everything. The man who made the decision was Captain Alexander Ball of HMS Alexander. Ball had been with Nelson at the Battle of the Nile, where the British Mediterranean fleet had destroyed Napoleon's fleet in Aboukir Bay just weeks earlier. After that victory, Nelson sent Ball to blockade Malta and prevent the French garrison from escaping. Ball arrived expecting a simple naval blockade. What he found was a popular uprising on the verge of collapse. The Maltese leaders pleaded for British help. Arms, ammunition, supplies, military advisors, anything. Ball made a decision that exceeded his authority. He landed Marines, he began supplying the Maltese rebels, he organized their siege, and he sent word to Nelson and to the British government that Malta could be taken if Britain committed resources to the campaign. This decision created a problem. Britain wasn't at war with the Knights of St. John. Technically, Britain was liberating Malta on behalf of the Knights, helping the Maltese restore the old order. But Ball knew, and the Maltese knew, that once Britain committed forces to taking Malta, Britain wouldn't give it back. The British government in London faced a dilemma. Committing forces to Malta meant diverting resources from other theaters. It meant antagonizing Russia,
which claimed to be the protector of the Knights' Order. It meant accepting responsibility for an island Britain had no legal claim to. But the strategic value was undeniable. Malta sat astride the Mediterranean sea lanes. Whoever controlled Malta could control trade routes to the Levant, to Egypt, to India. In British hands, Malta would be an unsinkable aircraft carrier, a naval base that could project British power throughout the Mediterranean. The government made its decision. Support the Maltese, take Malta, figure out the legal justifications later. What followed was not a conventional siege. It was something stranger, a hybrid campaign that combined British naval power, British military expertise, and Maltese irregular warfare into something neither side had attempted before. The British contributed ships, blockading Valletta from the sea and preventing French resupply. They contributed military advisors, including regular army officers who organized the Maltese into something resembling an army. They contributed artillery, dragged from ships to bombard French positions. And they contributed a few hundred Marines and soldiers, not enough to storm the walls, but enough to stiffen Maltese resolve. The Maltese contributed numbers, local knowledge, and desperate determination. They maintained the land siege, they built siege works, they fought skirmishes with French foraging parties, they endured French artillery fire from the walls, and they waited. The French garrison, under General Vaubois, was in a peculiar position. They held some of the strongest fortifications in the Mediterranean, but they were completely cut off. The British blockade was absolute. No supplies getting in, no reinforcements, no communication with France. Vaubois had maybe 4,000 soldiers. He had ammunition, he had artillery. What he didn't have was food. Malta is a rock in the Mediterranean. It doesn't grow enough food to feed its population, much less a French garrison and the Maltese civilians trapped in Valletta. The siege became a race. Could the Maltese and British starve out the French before the Maltese rebellion collapsed from exhaustion? Could Vaubois hold out long enough for a French relief force to arrive? Months passed. The siege settled into a grim routine. Occasional artillery exchanges, skirmishes when French patrols tried to forage, slow tightening of the blockade, and always hunger growing inside Valletta. By early 1799, conditions inside the French-held cities were deteriorating. Food stocks were running low. Vaubois imposed rationing, then stricter rationing. The Maltese civilians trapped inside the French lines began to starve. Vaubois faced an impossible choice: feed the civilians and run out of food for his soldiers faster, or prioritize his garrison and watch Maltese civilians die of starvation. He chose to prioritize his soldiers. The Maltese would remember this. Outside the walls, the British and Maltese were having problems of their own. The British government, distracted with crises in Europe and the Caribbean, provided minimal resources. The Maltese, exhausted by months of siege, were losing patience. Food was short for everyone. Captain Ball, now the de facto British commander on Malta, was performing a complicated balancing act. He had to keep the Maltese engaged in the siege without having the resources to pay or feed them properly. He had to maintain the blockade without enough ships. He had to justify the campaign to London without being able to promise when the French would surrender. Ball succeeded through personal charisma and careful diplomacy. He learned Italian to communicate with Maltese leaders. He treated the Maltese with respect, as allies rather than subjects. He shared what little resources he had, and he made promises about British protection after the war that he had no authority to make. By mid-1799, the campaign had settled into a stalemate. The French couldn't break out, the Maltese couldn't break in. Both sides were starving. Something had to break. What broke was French morale. As 1799 turned into 1800, it became clear that no relief was coming. Napoleon was trapped in Egypt, his fleet destroyed. The French government was too distracted with war in Europe to spare forces for Malta. The garrison was on its own. Inside Valletta, soldiers were dying of starvation and disease. Maltese civilians were dying faster. The city that had been the jewel of the Mediterranean, the home of the Knights of St. John, was becoming a charnel house. Vaugois held on. He was a professional soldier. He had orders to hold Malta. He would hold it until relieved or until physically unable to continue. But his soldiers were less committed. They hadn't signed up to starve to death on a rock in the Mediterranean. Morale collapsed. Discipline frayed. By September 1800, 2 years after the siege began, the end was inevitable. The French garrison was eating rats. Disease was rampant. The soldiers were too weak to man the walls effectively. Vaugois, gaunt and ill, finally accepted reality. On September 5th, 1800, exactly 2 years after the British arrived, General Vaugois surrendered. The terms were generous. The French garrison would be allowed to return to France on parole on condition they not fight against Britain until formally exchanged. The Maltese civilians would be freed. The island would be placed under British protection. The Union Jack was raised over Fort St. Elmo at the entrance to Grand Harbor. Malta was British, and it would remain British for the next 164 years. The immediate aftermath of the surrender revealed the horror of the siege. The French garrison, which had numbered 4,000 in 1798, was reduced to fewer than 2,000 effectives. The rest were dead from starvation, disease, and combat. Maltese civilians who had been trapped in Valletta emerged as walking skeletons. The British and Maltese who entered Valletta found a city transformed by siege. Beautiful palaces had been stripped for firewood. Gardens had been dug up searching for food. The streets stank of death. It would take years for the city to recover.
But Malta was free. The French occupation, which had begun with Napoleon's triumph, had ended in abject failure. And Britain had acquired, almost accidentally, one of the most strategically valuable pieces of real estate in the world. The question was, what would Britain do with it? Legally, Britain had no claim to Malta. The island belonged to the Knights of St. John. Britain had intervened to help the Maltese expel the French, supposedly to restore the Knights' rule. But nobody wanted the Knights back. Not the Maltese, who blamed them for surrendering to Napoleon. Not the British, who wanted the island for themselves. Britain proposed a compromise. Malta would be placed under British protection. The Knights would retain nominal sovereignty but no actual power. The Maltese would be allowed some local self-government but would accept British military occupation. The Knights protested. So did Russia, which claimed to be the Knights' protector after the fall of Malta. So did various Italian states that saw Malta as rightfully Italian. Britain ignored them all. Possession was 9/10 of the law, and Britain possessed Malta. The arguments were legal technicalities. The reality was British occupation backed by British naval power. The Treaty of Amiens in 1802, which temporarily ended war between Britain and France, included a provision that Britain would return Malta to the Knights. Britain signed the treaty, then ignored that provision. Malta was too valuable to give up. When war resumed in 1803, Britain made Malta a crown colony. The legal fiction was abandoned. Malta was British, and Britain would defend it as British territory. The Maltese, for the most part, accepted this.
British rule was better than French occupation and more stable than the Knights' declining order. What made Malta so valuable? Why was Britain willing to risk diplomatic complications and military commitments for a small limestone island with no natural resources? Location. Malta sits in the middle of the Mediterranean, almost exactly equidistant from Gibraltar and Alexandria, from Sicily and North Africa. Ships passing through the Mediterranean had to pass near Malta. Whoever controlled Malta controlled the sea lanes. For Britain, Malta became the key to Mediterranean strategy. It was a coaling station for steamships, a naval base for the Mediterranean fleet, a fortress that could interdict French or Italian naval movements, a symbol of British power in the south. During the 19th century, Malta's importance only grew. When the Suez Canal opened in 1869, Malta became even more critical. It sat on the route from Britain to India, the jewel of the British Empire. Protecting that route was a national priority. By World War I, Malta had become one of the most heavily fortified places on Earth. The Grand Harbor bristled with artillery. Submarines operated from Maltese bases. The island was a fortress and a fleet base. In World War II, Malta's strategic value was proven beyond doubt. German and Italian forces tried desperately to neutralize or capture the island. Malta endured some of the heaviest bombing of the war, but it held. British submarines and aircraft operating from Malta savaged Axis supply lines to North Africa, contributing directly to Rommel's defeat. King George VI awarded the George Cross, Britain's highest civilian honor, to the entire island of Malta in recognition of the population's courage under siege. It's the only time a whole population has received the award. Malta remained British until 1964, when it finally gained independence. Even then, Britain maintained military bases on the island until 1979. For 179 years, Malta was a cornerstone of British Mediterranean strategy. All of this flowed from those improvised decisions in 1798 to 1800, from Captain Ball's choice to support the Maltese rebellion, from the British government's decision to commit resources to a siege that might have failed, from the Maltese people's determination to resist French occupation. The liberation of Malta established patterns that would repeat across the British Empire. Indigenous uprising against a European occupier, British intervention ostensibly to help the natives, gradual British assumption of control, legal ambiguity resolved through possession and force, and finally, integration into the British imperial system as a crown colony. This pattern appeared in Egypt, in various African territories, in parts of Southeast Asia. The Malta model became a template for imperial expansion, disguised as liberation. For the Maltese, the British period was complicated. Britain brought stability, economic development, and protection from larger powers. The Maltese language and Catholic religion were respected in ways they hadn't been under the Knights or the French. Educational and economic opportunities expanded. But Malta was also subordinated to British strategic interests. The island's economy became dependent on servicing the British military. Maltese self-government was limited. Political activists who pushed for more autonomy or independence were suppressed. The Maltese relationship with Britain was never simple. Gratitude for liberation mixed with resentment of subordination, pride in Malta's role in the empire mixed with desire for self-determination, appreciation for British protection mixed with frustration at British control. These contradictions persisted until independence in 1964 and beyond. Even today, Malta's history as a British possession shapes its politics, its language, its legal system, and its international relations. For the British military, Malta provided something equally valuable: validation of a strategic approach that combined naval power with local alliance. The Malta campaign proved that Britain didn't need massive armies to project power globally. A few ships, a few hundred Marines, local alliance, and strategic patience could achieve what might otherwise require full-scale invasion. This approach shaped British imperial expansion throughout the 19th century. Work with local alliance when possible, use naval power to control sea lanes and support land operations, employ small professional forces rather than mass armies, patience rather than frontal assault. Malta also validated the importance of naval bases in an era of global empire. Britain couldn't control the seas without places to refit, resupply, and base its fleets. Malta, Singapore, Gibraltar, Cape Town, these became the keystones of British naval dominance. The empire was, fundamentally, a network of naval bases connected by sea lanes. The strategic vision that made Malta important in 1800 remained relevant through World War II and shaped British defense policy until the end of empire. Geography doesn't change. The sea lanes Malta controlled in 1800 mattered in 1945. They still matter today, though Britain no longer controls them. Yet for all its strategic importance, for all its influence on British imperial policy, the liberation of Malta remains a forgotten campaign. Why? Partly because it was overshadowed. Nelson's victory at the Nile was dramatic, decisive, a crushing defeat of French naval power. The Malta campaign was slow, unglamorous, a 2-year siege that ended not with a glorious battle, but with a starving garrison surrendering. Partly because the campaign doesn't fit comfortable narratives. It wasn't a British victory achieved by British forces alone. It was a joint operation with Maltese rebels. The British role was supporting, not leading, at least initially. This complicates the story of British military prowess. Partly because the legal and political aspects were messy. Britain acquired Malta through what was essentially theft, disguised as liberation. The Knights had legitimate sovereignty. Britain took it anyway. This doesn't fit narratives of British respect for law and treaties. And partly because Malta itself disappeared from British consciousness after independence. Once it was no longer British, its history as a British possession became less interesting to British audiences. The campaign that established British control became a forgotten footnote. But forgetting this campaign means losing important lessons about how empires expand through opportunism as much as planning, about how local alliance can be both essential and exploited, about how strategic geography shapes history, about how the messy reality of imperial expansion differs from the clean narratives of military glory.
The liberation of Malta was not a glorious triumph. It was a grinding siege, a diplomatic improvisation, and a strategic gamble that happened to pay off. British forces played a supporting role in a campaign where Maltese rebels did most of the fighting. The outcome was determined more by French starvation than British military brilliance. But it worked, and in working, it gave Britain control of the Mediterranean for more than a century. It established patterns of intervention and control that would be repeated globally, and it created a British-Maltese relationship that, for all its complications, endured for 164 years. 3 ships arriving at a small island in 1798, a captain exceeding his authority, a 2-year siege that almost collapsed, a starving French garrison surrendering, and an empire gaining one of its most valuable possessions. That's the liberation of Malta. Not a forgotten triumph of the Redcoats, but a forgotten example of how empires actually expand, through improvisation, through alliances of convenience, through patient application of limited force, through strategic opportunism disguised as liberation. The Redcoats were there, they mattered, but they were never the whole story. And perhaps that's why we forgot this campaign, because it doesn't fit the myths we prefer to tell about empire, about military glory, about how history happens. The truth is messier and more interesting. Thanks for watching. If you found this exploration of a forgotten campaign valuable, subscribe for more history that examines the complicated reality behind the simplified narratives. Next time, we'll look at another overlooked military operation that changed the course of empire. Until then, remember, the campaigns history forgets are often the ones that reveal the most about how power actually works.